Prior to the antebellum period in American history, abolitionism really hadn't gained much traction. There may have been people who were anti slavery, but they certainly were not overly vocal. That began to change in the 1830s as more and more abolitionists entered into the fray, especially in northern cities. So much so that you had various different societies move towards freeing black slaves and then helping to establish a country in Western Africa that we now know as Liberia, to where freed slaves can now migrate back to Africa and reinvigorate their African roots. So that was a movement, and the capital of Liberia, which is Monrovia, is actually named after James Monroe, the president of the United States at the time, who allowed for free blacks to leave and establish their own country back in West Africa. But not all African slaves wanted to leave. Many slaves by this time had now been third or even fourth generation slaves. They really didn't have a connection to Africa. They may be genealogically tied there, but otherwise, though, their roots weren't in Africa. So a lot of folks didn't really want to go back to Africa. They wanted to make their lives in America. They just wanted to be free. And I don't blame them. They were aided by abolitionists at the time who really started the movement of anti slavery, like William Lloyd Garrison, a Northeasterner who would eventually in Boston create a magazine publication called The Liberator, which would be an anti slavery publication that would discuss the wrongs not just of slavery, but what it's doing to erode the morality of white society and the wrongs of enslaving another human being. He deems it as being very anti Christ like, and he's absolutely right. Okay. Otherwise, though, slavery is not a human's natural condition. After all, Jews had been enslaved by the Egyptians and otherwise in biblical times. Those were all wrong. William Lloyd Garrison's arguments centered around Christian beliefs about how slavery is wrong and how there is historical precedent that proves that it's wrong from a biblical standpoint. That gains traction, so much so that various different abolitionists and other anti-slave organizations are now created in the Northeast, not just to undo slavery, but they're maybe thought to see other things as problems with the United States. You see, William Lloyd Garrison wasn't just an abolitionist. He saw a problem with the Constitution itself. He saw a problem with the Constitution as allowing slavery and being somewhat hypocritical. You're talking about freedoms for people, but not for slaves, who are people, by the way. He saw somewhat of a problem beyond just abolitionism and slavery. He saw a problem with the Union itself. And he discussed how the Constitution was the enabler of a lot of things that were wrong with American society, beginning with slavery. He thought that the Union should break up, especially, and as we're going to talk about here shortly, annexing Texas and other parts that would become parts of the United States, problems with slave states versus free states. He saw a problem with the Union itself. And so his detractors not only criticized his abolitionist standpoint, he criticized his anti-union standpoint. So he fell a little bit out of fervor, even with people who were anti-slavery. Most notably, you have a former slave himself, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a Maryland slave who eventually escaped and made his way up to Massachusetts, and he began a speaking circuit on the abolitionist movement, and eventually would spend a couple years in England talking about the evils of slavery. And upon return to the United States in the 1840s, he wanted to talk about the wrongs of slavery. So in this day and age, you have the Black Lives Matter movement who talks about we live in a country that we are to celebrate, but not everybody is accepted in this country, most specifically, black people. Agree or disagree with their point, they raise an issue that is certainly valid. We're celebrating a country that has some unquestionable warts, especially with our relationship with the black community. And it stems from our colonial days, centuries. They raise a point, okay? So, from that standpoint, it was Frederick Douglass who first raised that point, talking about celebrating July the 4th. What would slaves celebrate on July the 4th? Would slaves celebrate on July the 4th? What would there be to celebrate on July the 4th if you were a slave? Frederick Douglass raised that question, and it's a valid question. And it led to further belief in slavery being the wrong that it is. The wrongness of slavery as being anti-human. Frederick Douglass brought that to the community, and he invigorated it from an abolitionist standpoint. It wasn't without backlash or reprisal. You have anti-abolitionists who were very angry and bitter, especially in the South, because if you think about it, we talked about this in prior chapters, the South's entire economy is based off of agriculture, specifically cotton, and the availability of cheap slave labor is the driver behind all of that. Without cheap labor, without slave labor, you could undo the entire Southern economy. Therefore, northern communities who benefited from all of this agricultural output from the South could also potentially be threatened economically. Maybe not directly, but certainly indirectly. So from that standpoint, you have anti-abolitionists who light an absolute fire in reverse crusade. How dare you speak up against slavery? This is an American institution. This peculiar institution is what's driving our entire mode. So you have bitter reprisals and people hanged as a result, and people punished and threatened. You have abolitionists who had their businesses burned down. You have abolitionists who maybe even had their churches burned down. Otherwise, their families threatened. It's a tumultuous time if you're an abolitionist. Abolitionists themselves, though, would become divided. And I talked about William Lloyd Garrison and his crusade against the United States government as a whole, the Union. He criticized the Constitution. Frederick Douglass didn't criticize the Constitution. He believed in it. He just believed that black people had a place in it. So you have abolitionists who believed in freeing slaves and ending slavery in the United States, but they sometimes went to different extremes. Frederick Douglass took a far more reasonable approach. He just wanted to free slaves. William Lloyd Garrison wanted to break out the Union while freeing slaves. That's a pretty stark difference there. Okay? From the other standpoint, slave rebellions also became something of an issue, not just in the United States, but especially in the Caribbean and in South America, specifically in Brazil. And this is not to make light of slavery in what became the United States, but the overwhelming majority of African slaves would come to the Caribbean and Brazil in particular. It was far worse there than it was in the United States. Again, that doesn't make it right here, but just to paint a picture of what slavery and the slave movement looked like over the centuries. Slave rebellions were often exceptionally violent in Brazil and in the Caribbean, as you would kind of expect. Slavery is not a natural human condition, and if I were enslaved, I would surely want to try and free myself. Okay, that's perfectly reasonable to try and attempt that at least. Otherwise, though, on slave ships, You might have various different mutinies. There was one case, the Amistad. There's actually a movie that's been made about it, the Amistad, where you have a slave ship where a number of the slaves are able to free themselves, and then they're able to overtake the shipmates, and they keep the captain alive so as to bring them back to Africa. The problem was the slaves themselves were not navigators. They didn't realize that the ship's captain, who they were forcing to go back to Africa, actually sailed them from the Caribbean up to New York, where the slaves were now then arrested and then tried and imprisoned. Um, that's a problem. You also begin a political movement in the country to where if you have new states emerge, there were abolitionists who developed a political party that promoted the idea of new states being free. Free soil, free from slavery. In other words, we want to create new states where there are no slaves. So you have a free soil political movement that begins to take shape at this form, whose entire platform is abolitionist. And then, of course, you have various different works from abolitionists, literary works, as we talked about earlier about American literature. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a famous literary work in the 1850s that gave a broader perspective of the slave plight in an abolitionist movement. If you get a chance, take a read at it. It talks about various different slaves and their plight on a plantation and how things go from there. So the antebellum period is marked by a number of different things: medical pushback, other advances, a revival of spirituality, new spiritualities like Mormonism, literature, literary works, various other different publications, and then, of course, the abolitionist movement.